Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's Ken and Paul back again to talk today about geopolitics, and in particular, the biggest elephant in the Middle Eastern room. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this conversation. And yeah, you know what? We have to jump in, especially after the events that took place between Israel and Tehran the other day.
Yeah, it's this long-standing, complicated problem, but obviously thank you for joining as well, Ken, because doing it on your own is well, frankly, a bit of a waste of time. But in terms of the whole Middle Eastern situation and the issue of Israel and Iran, the issue of Hamas, for me, there's been a massive oversimplification. People are just having very binary thinking about what's going on, and it's why here we are nearly 10 months since the Hamas offensive, which started the whole war in Gaza. And we've obviously saw last April where there was an escalation, which fizzled out pretty quickly. And here again, of course, we're back to another escalation, which in principle could be deemed to be more serious than the one in April. But I always come back to the point with regards to the United States and their role in it. And for me, there's absolutely no contradiction in saying this. I know I've had a lot of people over the last 10 months getting in touch going, that doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. It's not. The United States will always support Israel with regards to a conflict, but supporting them, rather like supporting Ukraine, is not putting US boots on the ground in Israel to fight a war in the future with the Iranians. They will arm them, they will supply them with weapons, they will finance them, of course they will, rather like they do with Ukraine, but rather like Ukraine. The United States will always want to be a proxy. It will never want to get involved because it simply cannot, under any circumstances, afford to get into a confrontation with the Iranians. Not least, we've seen since December last year, the Houthis of all groups or factions, whatever you want to call them, basically and I'm going to use the crude terminology, has handed the United States its ass on a plate with regards to ships going through the Red Sea. The US is incapable of doing anything. So if it can't subjugate the Houthis, which it won't, it's certainly never going to subjugate or risk any direct confrontation with Iran. And also with regards to Houthis, they've done everything to avoid any direct confrontation with them. So this is the US MO. It's always been the case. The US will only go and have any sort of direct, inverted commas, confrontation. And you've obviously had experience of this yourself, Ken, with, like, say, Iraq, for example, where the US could just go in, carpet bomb the whole country, and send the military when there was nothing left, and then declare victory. Because they didn't have an army. There was no way they could defend the country. Well, Iran is not Iraq. Iran has an enormous, maybe 1.5 million, 2 million strong army. It has weapons technology. The US is not sure what it's got. It certainly appears to have hypersonics. There's the age-old question, does it have nuclear weapons? Maybe, maybe not, we don't know. There's a lot of rumors, and some of the rumors of, obviously, comes out of the United States, who see it as an excuse to sanction Iran or whatever else it wants to do. But if the US was hell-bent on going to war with Iran, it would have done so last October. It's not going to wait 10 months and then go, oh, now we've got a good opportunity to do this, because likewise in April, get a perfect opportunity to go to war with Iran on the back of the escalation between the Israelis and the Iranians, and they didn't. In fact, they were permanently on the phone trying to prevent that happening. There was endless back channels with the Iranians, even to the point where they said, well, Israel can bomb a target or two, just an empty building. No one needs to know it's an empty building. Just let them bomb it so they can save face. Okay, let's just do that. And that's exactly what happened. The other thing I think worth mentioning of what happened in April was when the Iranians launched hundreds of missiles and fired them into Israel. They hit certain targets. The rest of them were never designed to hit targets. They were to strategically map out the entire Iron Dome, which the Iranians did and have done so. That gives them enormous strategic advantage if, as there is, an escalation now, and obviously we'll talk about what's now started the escalation again, and the reasons and what the rationale behind this is. But I wanted to mention the role of the United States. The US will always have to, and it has no choice whether it wants to or not, defend Israel. And we all know the reasons why. There is an enormous Israeli lobby that has huge influence in the Congress. It has huge influence across the United States. And the US will always bend over backwards to assist them. But there comes a point, and I've said this before during the Trump administration, repeatedly Netanyahu wanted to unilaterally bomb Iran, and he was told it's not happening. And when I say repeatedly, during the Trump administration, it probably happened 200 times. And it was like, no, it's not happening. We're not doing that. You know, because the United States, from their own perspective, knows that if there's an escalation, and just say for argument's sake, they were to be sucked into this war, what would happen? Every US base would be destroyed in the Middle East. And I know people say once again, oh, there's 12 dozen US ships heading towards the Mediterranean. This is an aggressive move. It isn't. It's a defensive move. It's to try and prevent an escalation between the Israelis and the Iranians. It is not designed for that to go, I know, let's start firing missiles into Iran, because if they do, the entire 12 ships or whatever else is there will be toast. They'll be sunk within minutes. And that's the big difference. Iran has capabilities that maybe even a decade ago, 5 years ago, it didn't have. It does have them now. And the United States is never going to go to war, because what does that mean? They're going to try and put boots on the ground in Iran. How? How are they going to do this? And then we haven't even got to the point. What happens if Iran shuts the Straits of Hormuz and oil goes to $300 a barrel? The United States financial system will collapse in the blink of an eye. There's too many things that are hugely problematic for the US. And the other point is, what does the US gain from going to war with Iran? What's the win for the United States in making this happen? Because the truth of the matter is, the Israelis couldn't win a war against Hamas. How is it ever going to win a war against Iran? It's not going to win a war. And the United States, by its own admission, couldn't win a war now again with Russia and China. It's not saying there would ever be a sort of conventional war, but they haven't good. Why haven't they? They don't have the military personnel to do it, and also they don't have the military hardware, because it's all being sent to Ukraine and blown up. They don't have anything left to fight a war. They're 2 or 3 years away from being able to ever, in inverted commas, fight a war. So everything's stacked against them. Now, it doesn't mean they can't get sucked into something, but there's a world of difference between being sucked into something and actually being the agent provocateur who wants, a war to happen. Now, obviously, what's the principal thing, and I'll just mention it then, obviously I'll give way to you, Ken, was the fact that the Palestinian political leader, Haniyeh, was in Tehran for the inauguration of the new president in Iran, of course, and he was killed. And on Tehran, so on Iranian soil, that's a huge provocation, of course, by the Israelis. Had actually admitted doing it, but it's obvious it was them who were responsible. We'll put it this way, it's almost certain they were responsible. And that's why we're kind of now waiting for the Iranian response.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is the one thing that, to me, the United States, and what you said, you brought up about in the Trump administration, they, Netanyahu wanted to go after Iran and he wouldn't let him. Well, the Trump administration is not in there. Biden is not running anything. Kamala Harris is not running anything. But guess who is in charge pretty much of foreign affairs? A dual citizen by the name of Blinken. Now, Blinken, of course, is going to play both sides of the fence here. But while the United States doesn't want to get pulled into a big regional war or even have something that might extend into Russia and China, the United States, unfortunately, is not in a position to do what needs to be done. Because when Netanyahu got out of office, lost power, there was relative peace in the Middle East. We saw Saudi Arabia signing the Abraham Accords. Things were starting to move towards peace between, the Arab nations, the Muslim nations, as well as Israel. Then Netanyahu got back in. And what did he do? He brought in absolutely rabid anti-Palestinian, anti-Iranian foreign ministers. These individuals are the ones who would love to see the world burn just to achieve their whatever ideological goals. So it's a small group within Israel that is acting as if they have nothing to lose and believes that the United States will back them no matter what they do. We have the International Court of Justice and the ICC declaring the Netanyahu and a number of these ministers as criminals to be indicted for genocidal acts, and it doesn't matter. So on the international stage, it's almost as if there's no repercussions. And as long as the United States stands up and acts as if, especially in the media or in the public eye, that Israel can do whatever it wants and we're going to back Israel, Netanyahu is going to keep pushing the envelope further, whether it's bombing Beirut, bombing Syria, going in and doing assassinations in Tehran. It doesn't matter. As long as there's nothing that stops Netanyahu from, realizing that the risks are going to be great, then I think he's going to keep doing, stepping his bounds as much as possible. But with that being said, you take a look at what occurred in Iran yesterday, which is today. Tens of millions of people in the streets demanding blood, demanding some sort of retribution. The red flag of revenge being put on the, flying at the mosques. On the flip side, what is going on in Israel right now? They are on the cusp of civil war. The people do not want a war with Palestine. They don't want war with anything. They are suffering. And all it takes really is some sort of spark on either side correctly done. So if Iran did the right retribution that was able to get the people of Israel to oppose their government even more and say, we do not want this thing escalating, that, in my opinion, might be the best retribution that the Tehran government could do if they could find the right button to push.
Yeah, that's the problem is, though. I mean, yeah, you raise a number of extremely important points. What I would say first off is, and people always say, well, the US would say this, but they don't ask the question, why are they saying it? Blinken came out and basically said, we had no idea that we're going after Hania. And there's an argument to say, well, I can't believe that's true. And I am one of the fiercest critics of the United States, as everyone knows. But what I would say is, it wouldn't surprise me if the US didn't know anything. I don't think for 1 minute the United States is going to sit there and go, that's a good idea. Let's deliberately cause a massive provocation. Because bearing in mind, it's not only did it happen on Iranian soil, it also relates to obviously the Palestinians, or in this case, Hamas. And so therefore, it's kind of a double whammy in this situation. So it's going to have serious repercussions and ramifications. So it is entirely plausible the US didn't know anything about it, but what's very clear is Netanyahu wants this war. He wants to escalate, but I mean, he's been nibbling at the edges to get Hezbollah to open up a second front. But again, look at what happened in 2006. They lost the war against Hezbollah, and Israel is not in any shape whatsoever to fight a war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is far more capable of fighting a war now than it was, well, basically 18 years ago. So that's a huge problem. But Netanyahu needs the war because this has to continue, because the reality is, without the war, he will be out of political office, and he's out of political office. Okay, again, people are innocent until proven guilty, but there's criminal cases against him outstanding, and the argument is, well, then he's going to be in the firing line for whatever that might mean. And one or the other, I don't care, frankly, about discussing that. It's irrelevant. Whatever happens will happen. But he's desperate, and he's really trying to keep this war going. And I think in his mind, he feels, well, yes, you're right, Ken. He thinks he's got the support of the United States, or the US will back him to the hilt, and somehow he's going to come out winning, and he's going to crush all the opposition in the Middle East, and then the people will think he's the greatest leader they've ever had, and they'll forget all the other problems, and he'll stay in office for the next 20 years. I mean, or whatever it is. And that's what he thinks, and it's just in his imagination, because the reality is, if this does escalate, and we'll come on to what Iran may or may not do shortly, if it escalates, it's going to drag not just the Iranians into a conflict with Israel, it will drag Hezbollah. It will reassert Hamas's war, which with the Israelis, whatever that might mean. Then, of course, there's the Houthis, the Yemenis, who are going to get involved. The risk is, we certainly know Iraqi militias will, maybe Iraq in a broader sense will. The issue then is, will Syria get involved? Maybe, maybe not. Turkey, possibly. I mean, okay, Erdogan said many things during this conflict. Sounded very tough, but hasn't actually done anything. But he's saying, if this escalates and the Israel were to invade Lebanon, they will then get involved, and if they get involved, they're going to need an enormous military. So Israel can't win this. And then there's always the risk. Egypt, okay, that's a real outside bet that will happen, but Egypt might get involved as well. Israel is in serious trouble if that happens. And it might be arguably a huge gamble from Netanyahu, and he's desperate because he's desperate to stay in office. But it comes back to the point: what does the United States gain in terms of trying to provoke a wider war? Nothing. It stands to lose massive credibility. It will, again, already lost credibility because it's been seen to defend, at times, the indefensible with respect to the conduct of the Israelis. We don't need to go into that, but they have suffered enormous credibility damage. The whole Houthi thing has made the US look like the naked emperor, as I've said many times before. And, not least the damage the Ukraine war's done to US reputation as well, because everybody looks at US military hardware and goes, well, it's useless. It's not a game changer. It's just a business as usual. Everything gets destroyed, and the next apparent game changer turns up. So the US can't afford to take the risk, because if it gets sucked in a direct capacity in some way, which I'm not dismissing that it can't happen completely, because you're right, Ken, there might be situations where it's possible it could happen. But let's just say, for argument's sake, it happens. What's going to immediately happen? Every US base in West Asia, Middle East will be destroyed, probably. Then, whatever ships, flotillas, whatever strike groups that are, all these ships, the navies are now just sitting ducks, except maybe nuclear submarines. But all the rest of them are sitting ducks because with hypersonic weapons, which the Iranians have. There's no defense against them. So they will just pick off all these ships, sink them. Can you imagine the US trying to face the embarrassment of that? And then what's the US supposed to do? Put boots on the ground with what? With what equipment? Thousands of miles from home? Coordinating it from bases that no longer exist in the region? It's just not going to happen. But for sure, the next question you rightly raise is what Iran's response can be. Now, we know there was, for what worth it is, I don't know, probably nothing. There was some resolution raised in the UN, which was a sensible move with regards to Israel's conduct. It probably won't result in anything, but at least they've gone through official channels. There has been a meeting between Iran and all its so-called regional proxies. So, of course, that's going to be Hamas. It's going to be Hezbollah. It's going to be all the Iraqi militias and whoever else. It's debatable who else is involved. So what are they going? They're discussing some strategic move. Okay, there's a lot of words coming out. There's a sort of period of mourning over the death of Haniyeh and whatever else is going on. So, I mean, I don't know whether this is the case, but the argument is at the weekend you might see an Iranian response with potentially these regional sort of players who are their allies effectively. Now, the claim is it could be worse than what they did the last time to Israel, but the problem is they now know all the weak spots in the Iron Dome, which has proved to be a bit useless anyway. So they're going to know the weaknesses because they found out last time, and that was the whole purpose of what they did. Now, are they going to go all gung-ho and just, we don't know exactly what they intended, but if they do that, which is going to have a devastating impact on Israel, then what's Israel's response? Therefore, then the escalation risks get out of control. But Israel is not in a position to launch a ground war against Iran. I mean, how? With what? You can't do it. So what's it going to be? Just keep firing rockets, keep flying jets? I mean, then it becomes a war of not so much a ground war in that sense, but the risk is it could escalate into that. We can't dismiss that that's what would happen. But if you then get all these other regional players involved, Israel's fighting a war on 4 or 5 fronts. It cannot do it. It couldn't even fight a war against Hamas. I mean, it's practically tried to give up the war with Hamas and go, well, let's try and nibble away at Hezbollah. And that's not failed. They haven't really provoked anything to start a proper second front, so to speak, with them. So there's a number of really enormous amounts of permutations in what could happen. We have to, I guess, wait and see. There is no doubt on the back of this, the United States has been on the phone to the Chinese and the Russians going, what can we do about this? We don't, because nobody wants an escalation. Nobody except the Israelis. Nobody wants that because it's not going to achieve anything. And the problem is the rest of West Asia, so the Saudis, the last thing they want is a war on their doorstep like that. Because, so, the end of the day, the US will fight proxy wars. But a proxy war against Iran, what's it going to achieve? I mean, do they think they're going to destroy Iran? No. Well, let's assume they think they could. Do they think it's going to be the end of the Iranian governmental structure the way it is? No, it's just going to embolden people in Israel, make them more in Iran, and make them more anti-Western, not pro-Western. So the US, as little as they think about what their objectives are, they had objectives that were ridiculous with regards to Russia and Ukraine, for sure. But they had objectives and they failed. They failed completely. But they don't have any objectives to go to war with Iran. Okay, people talk about all the hotheads, all the few hotheads in Congress, but they don't make decisions about what happens or doesn't happen. But the US stands to gain nothing and stands to lose enormously if he ends up with a war escalating between, or all-out war between Israel and Iran, and then all the other allies will get involved. But you can guarantee that there's enormous amounts of back channel conversation going on between, let's say, the Russians, the US, the Chinese, and whoever else, and the Saudis and countless other nations going, we have to do something to stop this happening. No matter what grievances Iran has, and, depending on what action they take, what grievances then the Israelis have. Because at the end of the day, yes, there was this one-time mythical idea of this greater Israel. This is all a myth. It's all in the dim, distant past. West Asia is nothing like it was even 5 years ago. I mean, Saudis and the Iranians have reproached me. The Saudis want a two-state solution. They want all the things Israel's not prepared to give. I mean, if you look at the region, nobody supports the Israelis. So the Israel's effectively on their own with some mythical idea the United States is going to throw the kitchen sink from their perspective in support of them directly. Well, okay, that's a hell of a gamble, but Netanyahu is fighting for his political future and what that might mean when he's no longer in politics. Forget the ICC or the ICJ ruling. I mean, that's an entirely different matter, and whether that ever comes to anything is an entirely different matter. But Israel has suffered enormous reputational damage. And yes, the US will always stand by them, but increasingly, when you look at statements coming out of even the Europeans, they're very low to be on the side of the Israelis. They just very much mute about this. They don't really want to talk about it. They don't want to get involved in it. But it's interesting what happened yesterday. The United States also got on the phone to the European Union going, we need to do something. And the European Union panicking, going, well, we can't allow this to escalate. And then in the UK Parliament, they're going, you can't resolve these conflicts with bombs and bullets. Well, they want it resolved with bombs and bullets when it came to Ukraine. Why? Because they think, and still some deluded mindset, think Ukrainians can win, even though they've lost the war already. But with regards to Israel and Iran, they're panicking because they know Israel cannot win this, and Israel's likely to be defeated. And the problem is, if Israel's defeated, what happens to the nation state of Israel? It might well cease to exist. Then you've got millions of Israelis. Where are they going to go? Because they're not going to stay there. They're all going to want to leave. I mean, there's at least 1 million left already, and a lot went to the US, and who knows where else they've gone, probably other parts of Europe. Well, when you've got millions more who all want to leave, then the risk is, and it's definitely a risk, it's a plausible outcome that there's no longer any nation state of Israel. It just becomes the nation state of Palestine in totality. That sounds outrageous. It sounds unbelievable, but it could happen. And these are the kind of things that are also factoring into the mindset of the United States. And here's the interesting point. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that was to happen with Israel ceasing to exist as a nation state. What does that mean for Congress? What does that mean in terms of who's influencing US politics or controlling much of US politics? It would cease to have any function. So, there are massive ramifications in terms of what this could do domestically to the United States. I'm not talking about Iran going to war with the United States and trying to bomb the United States. Nothing like that. I'm just talking what the political fallout would be. And what it would probably do is the US and Germany is dead and buried, pretty much. It will be the end of it in totality. And that could also would very rapidly end the Ukraine war on very bad terms from the West perspective, and NATO would cease to exist very rapidly. I mean, the consequences would be enormous. Whereas the alternative is we don't go to war with them. We do everything to try and prevent it like they did previously. I'm not saying the US won't get sucked into something, or it's very, very fluid, it's very complicated, it's very difficult, but the idea, and I will stand by this, the US wanted to go to war with Israel back in October, and I said that's not the case. Well, it clearly isn't the case, because 10 months later, they're not at war with them. They wanted to do that. They've had plenty of opportunities to do it. So What, they suddenly want to do it now? What's changed? Nothing. In fact, things are a lot worse for Israel than it was last October. And for the United States, it's a lot worse. The US's reputation in the whole region is in tatters. It's, they were in a far better position to do it if they wanted to back 10 months ago. As time progresses, the US's position gets weakened. And, at the end of the day, why are they panicking and on the phone to the Europeans? Because the US is caught between a rock and a hard place, and it has no way out of this mess because of the influence the Israeli lobby, etc., has over the United States. Okay, a lot of people say they control all of the US. They don't. But they certainly have a huge influence, and this is why lobbying needs to be outlawed. It needs to be made illegal. It needs to be a criminal offence. Okay, that's not going to happen. People should be put in prison for 10 years if they're doing it. It's the only way to stop that happening in the US, and maybe you'll start to have a Congress that's interested in what matters to the American people and not, the Israelis or whoever else they're, in the back pocket of to implement policy decisions, particularly globally.
Yeah, as we wrap this up here, the two things I want to point on, and it's exactly what you said. What we saw a couple weeks ago with Congress prostrating themselves at the feet of Netanyahu was just one of the most disgusting and enlightening things anybody could have ever seen. How the hegemony of the world, at least in their own eyes, bowing and applauding Netanyahu, who is, for all intents and purposes, a war criminal. That speaks volumes right there. But the important thing is this, and it's what I always try, whether it's in social media, in conversations with people. There is a difference between the political movement known as Zionism and the Jewish people themselves. Prior to the establishment of Israel, Jews lived in the Ottoman Empire. They lived in Persia/Iran. They lived all around the Levant with very little persecution. It was only the political movement starting in Europe, mostly coming out of the Dreyfus affair in France, but the political movement to demand a homeland for the Jews, which really underlying that certain entities wanted that area for their own personal interests, that Zionism, the political movement, has really come across. And you see it where Joe Biden, who's not a Jew, declaring I'm a Zionist, Netanyahu declaring Biden as a Zionist. Zionism is a political movement, just like Antifa, just like communism, and it has its ideologies as well as its political motivations. The Middle East will not be, and we saw this immediately after the attack in Tehran. The Ayatollah comes out and he didn't use the word Jew. He said the Zionist terrorist government. He's pointing at the political movement. He's pointing at the political stances that have caused many wars and many conflicts and that keep this whole division going. So in my opinion, until the United States disavows Zionism and its power and hold on political officials, government officials, and the region as a whole, that things are not going to change. But the other thing I was going to add is I am absolutely in agreement with you that the major powers do not want a war, a regional war. They don't want a conflict that could potentially lead to Netanyahu firing off the nuclear button because he's got nothing left to lose. But with that being said, unfortunately, history has shown that the more players you get into a field, a region, the more atrocities that get done, the more little tit-for-tat attacks, somewhere, somehow, there is an unknown catalyst, a spark that hits that tinderbox and can cause the war to go, no matter what diplomacy is done behind the scenes. And more than anything, that is my biggest fear right now. And it could be the Houthis, because the Houthis are beholden to no one.
Yeah, but they don't really have the potential. Yeah, they can cause problems for sure, and they do, and they've given bloody noses to a whole bunch of people, but they're not militarily capable of a proper offensive on their own.
No, but the Black Hand in 1914 was able to kill and assassinate Archduke Ferdinand, and they didn't do it with the government's approval, and it was a very small group of people. That's what I mean.
Oh, yes, okay, yes.
You can have a small rogue element that can create the scenario and environment for a wider explosion.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I would counter that as well, which is the big difference between 1914 or 1939 is we have nuclear capability now. That changed everything. If we'd have been 70, 80, well, no, if it had been, say, 1940, and okay, this is a bit of a strange one, and history was different. The Ukraine war would have caused a world war. We would have had a world war by now. The reason we don't is because the stakes mean it's so-called nuclear Armageddon, and nobody wants that. No one is ever going to want that. So that is always mindful why the main players will never escalate this. So if the main players don't escalate it, who's going? Okay, Israel potentially could use nuclear weapons, but if Israel does that, it's going to be the end of Israel as a nation. I mean, the ramifications would be the US would just have to sit there and go, no, we can't defend this anymore. It's one thing, support them, but doing that, because that is going to set off a chain reaction of a whole bunch of things. Now, I'm not saying they won't do it or there isn't a risk of it, but we're in a very different world now in that regard, because the nuclear deterrent changed the whole complexity of warfare. It's very different. And okay, Israel can be hell-bent on going to war, and maybe in the end, maybe the Iranians will be. But that's it. No one else in West Asia is going to want to get involved. I mean, I'm talking about the Saudis. Okay, yes, the Houthis will, and probably the Iraqi militias and Hezbollah, etc. But aside from that, no one else is going to get involved and fight any war on directly, because they know once they're involved directly, and the risk is it's rather like the US not wanting to get involved in a direct war with Ukraine and Russia, because then the risk is it escalates into a world war or a nuclear war, and no one wants that. The US absolutely has made it clear, and they keep going, no, we don't want this. No, you're not giving you that. No, you can't do this. And they're being very explicit. Okay, yeah, they've armed them to the teeth, the Ukrainians, but within reason. So the argument is the United States should do precisely the same thing. And the argument might be, well, depending on how far both sides are prepared to go, but depending on how far Israel goes, it might be that there are elements, because there are already elements going, we cannot go to war, opposition parties in Israel going, we have to manage this very carefully. One thing Netanyahu wanted it, but if no one else wants it, I see Netanyahu being removed from office. Exactly dares to suggest anything that could see a major escalation, and that could happen. Or maybe the United States will go, well, this is just a bridge too far, and we're going to have to intervene. I mean, they have done this with the Ukrainians. They told them in no uncertain terms, you are not to do X, Y, and Z. And if you do, you're on your own. They basically phone up the Russians, go do whatever the hell you like. Because the United States will only ever go to war with Russia or risk a global confrontation if the nation state of Israel is threatened. Of the United States threat. Apart from that, they're not going to do it, because why would they? There's Yeah, they'll make a lot of noise and they'll threaten countries and have regime change. That's a very different scenario. But one point I wanted to ask you, Ken, and see what your perspective on this is. It was interesting, and there were stories coming out that when Kamala Harris met Netanyahu, she kind of played the law going, you're going to have to change, you're going to have to look for a ceasefire, this war has to end. And kind of, okay, I'm not saying Kamala Harris is going to change anything, but she made these kind of quite high octane statements, apparently. And isn't it a bit interesting? A few days later, the assassination of the Hamas political leader. Now, is that a coincidence? Maybe it is. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that point.
Well, like I said, I truly don't believe Biden and Kamala are in charge of anything. And
No.
and Netanyahu, for all his negative aspects, he is an extraordinarily cunning politician. He can walk into a room and read the people, in an instant. And he knows he can get away with a lot of things with the current administration. I think, in honesty, like you said, Trump probably in many cases made some phone calls, said, you're not going to do this, and they didn't do it. But with that being said as well, I think with Blinken, well, I think Blinken has dual loyalties. And there are certain red lines he will not cross and doesn't want to see crossed. But I think there's a lot that he allows Netanyahu to do while feigning ignorance. But in the meantime, he's pretty much running all foreign policy. Kamala probably proved to Netanyahu when they had their meeting that she was an idiot. And Netanyahu said, Biden's demented, she's an idiot, and Blinken will play both sides of the fence, so I can do what I want. And I think that's really what the whole thing was about.
So yeah, I guess we have to just hope that whatever the Iranian response is, and we guarantee there will be, given the gravity of what happened, well, like happened in April, and there is sufficient. I don't doubt the Iranians will have been on the phone to the Russians, Chinese, and they will have been telling them, listen, you need to be careful and doing X, Y, and Z, and what, okay, you want retribution. Okay, okay, that's your decision, but you need to be extremely careful how you respond, or your responses to this. So it remains to be seen. We have to hope in some ways it fizzles out like it did in April, but the risk is it might not do. And as much as whatever the Iranian response is, it then becomes down to the question of what's the Israeli response to the Iranian response. Rather, I said will happen in April, but as ever, I'm one of the fiercest critics of the US with regards to its foreign policy. But with regards to what's going on in West Asia and with Israel, it's a very, very different situation. The US will always defend it, but there are certainly things the United States doesn't want Israel to do. That doesn't mean Israel won't do it. And principally, this is a war that Netanyahu wants to win. And he doesn't want it to end in some ways, because then the question is what happens to him on a personal level. And that's the fundamental driver of this. Yes, there are other, it's not the sole reason why it's hugely problematic, but the United States has culpability for sure. And maybe the United States can talk him back from this escalating into a full-blown war and then a regional war. Remains to be seen. But as ever, this is complicated, and a lot of these simplistic ideas. Oh, well, the US must have done this, the US must have done that. I'm sorry, that's not necessarily the case, because the role and the influence the Israeli lobby has domestically in US politics, and therefore by extension US foreign policy, is immense. And in many ways, as much as a lot of nations are beholden to the United States and have been historically, The United States isn't run by Netanyahu, as people suggest, but certainly they have enormous influence, and they believe that the United States will support them no matter what. That massively complicates problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, Paul, I think we got this covered. To let everybody know, as events do arise, whether in Israel, Iran, the Middle East, we will be there to give our thoughts and commentary. Paul, thank you as always for being a part of this discussion.
Well, thank you, of course.
And to everybody else, thank you. And we will be back with another podcast soon.